Vi befinner oss på Engelsbergs bruk och årets Engelsbergsseminarium som har temat Leadership and Statecraft. I det pass vi nu kommer att få följa tar ett antal inledare ett historiskt grepp och beskriver ett antal framgångsrika ledares väg fram till makten.
Of course we cannot have a seminar on statecraft or leadership without having Machiavelli on the stage in the shape of Alexander Lee. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And I don't know quite how to respond to that, but right, nearly 500 years after his death, Niccolo Machiavelli still looms large over debates about leadership. Thanks to the invidious reputation of his best-known work, The Prince, he's come to be associated with an uncompromising pragmatism, cunning and ruthlessness, and his name is rarely invoked without a sense of praise or blame. We habitually brand political leaders Machiavellian as a manner of stressing their skill or illustrating their flaws, and every year another slew of books appears dedicated to showing how leaders can become more, or perhaps more rarely, less Machiavellian. Yet precisely because Machiavelli's reputation is so baleful, because his name is applied so widely, it has come to obscure what he actually said about leadership, and more importantly, what he didn't. Today, I'd like to offer a very brief corrective to this. I'm going to address 4 questions. Why did leadership matter to Machiavelli? What did a good leader look like? How radical was Machiavelli? And what lessons can Machiavelli teach leaders today? So, why did leadership matter to Machiavelli? Machiavelli's Italy was a turbulent place. In the Storie Fiorentine, he wrote of it as questo guasto mondo, this ruined world, a place of upheaval and suffering ruled over by fortune, the goddess of chance. Unlike many contemporary humanists who imagined fortune as a blindfolded figure turning a wheel, Machiavelli often pictured her like this, a beautiful, capricious woman, as changeable as the wind and as kind or as cruel as the waves. It was an apposite image. In the late 15th century, Italy was a patchwork quilt of states. There was the Kingdom of Naples, the Papal States, Duchy of Milan, a handful of little lordships, and a few republics like Florence. Each had its own unique constitution, but they all shared some of the same structures and all grappled with the same vulnerabilities. When, in 1494, Charles VIII... Well, we'll just have to imagine Charles VIII, I'm afraid. Charles VIII of France marched into Italy. The peninsula was plunged into a series of wars that would last on and off for the next 60 years. States changed hands with alarming speed and regularity. Regimes came and went, and uncertainty reigned. In one city, there were no fewer than 30 changes of regime. And Machiavelli suffered too. After about 14 years as second chancellor of the Florentine Republic, he was arrested, imprisoned and tortured when the Machiavelli returned to take back control of the city. As Machiavelli recognised, the question of what made a good leader was hence of vital importance to political leaders themselves. Whether they were princes with formal titles, elected heads of republican governments or unofficial rulers of the city, they all needed to know how power, once acquired, could be retained. But it also had a wider significance too. As Machiavelli explained in the Discorsi, the liberty of a republic, like Florence, depended on its citizens. They could only live free from foreign domination and domestic tyranny if they were committed to their freedom. But because people are fickle and often choose self-interest over the common good, Machiavelli believed they needed good leaders to keep them on the right track. So, what did a good leader look like? Machiavelli was not the first person to tackle this problem. As far back as classical antiquity, learned men had been advising princes about the qualities they needed, and these ad hoc works had later evolved into a complete literary form, the so-called Mirror of Princes. This had acquired fresh significance during the Renaissance. From the 14th century onwards, humanists had churned out a growing number of treatises, and like earlier writers, they had believed that the key to political survival was virtue. Naturally, they glossed this in different ways, but they generally agreed that it was just an exaggerated form of those moral qualities to which all Christians should aspire, namely justice, fortitude, faith, hope, and so on. Machiavelli thought this was all hogwash, though. In The Prince, which he wrote shortly after being released from prison in 1513, he explained that in seeking to describe the characteristics of an ideal prince, contemporary humanists had confined themselves to a world of theoretical fancy, far removed from the often harsh realities of politics. As such, any ruler who attempted to follow their advice too rigidly would find himself unprepared to deal with the world that actually existed. What a prince needed, Machiavelli believed, was to learn how not to be good. To explain what he meant by this, he returned to the rather misogynistic image of fortune as a woman. If a prince was too inflexible or too weak to stand up to her, he said, he'd be pushed around. Only a man who could adapt himself to her wilds and who, if necessary, was prepared to beat and coerce her would receive her favour. What a prince required, therefore, was not virtue in the traditional sense, but virtu, the quality of being a vir, a man. He needed to be bold and daring. He needed to rise above the base pursuit of riches, and above all, he needed to govern in such a way that it would bring him honour and glory. To do this, Machiavelli argued, a prince needed three things. First, he needed a means of defending himself against a foreign enemy. At the time, most states relied on mercenaries, but bitter experience had taught Machiavelli how dangerous this was. Not only were mercenaries expensive, he argued, but they were also disunited, ambitious, undisciplined, and disloyal. Far better, Machiavelli believed, to rely on a citizen militia. Those citizens were not as well trained and often much more difficult to organise. They at least had a vested interest in defending their homeland. The second thing that a prince needed was an understanding of how to conduct himself so as to avoid provoking internal subversion from his subjects. The key, of course, was to avoid being hated too much. And to do this, a prince needed to do away with all the things that princes were usually expected to do. The first quality that was expected of them was generosity. If a prince wanted to buy support with his largesse, Machiavelli argued, he had to be pretty lavish. But if he did this, he'd quickly run out of his own money and would have to raise taxes, which would obviously make his subjects hate him. If he was parsimonious, by contrast, living on his own means, he would show true generosity to his subjects and thereby win their affection. It was the same with compassion. Although princes always liked to be compassionate, they should not use mercy indiscriminately. If a prince's opponents think they can rebel without facing any consequences, it would be impossible to keep order. Far better to be cruel. For while love is fickle, fear is sure. This came with a caveat, though. A prince needed to take care that he was not so cruel that he was hated, because in time the citizens' hatred would eventually outweigh their fear with predictable results. Honesty didn't need to trouble the prince much either. Of course, it'd be nice if he was honest, but since few men were, it would be madness for the prince to keep his word on principle. Like the fox, he needs to know how to sniff out danger and how to avoid it without compromising himself. As such, he must never honour his word when doing so puts him at a disadvantage. In short, he must know how to be a great liar and dissimulator. It was also important to know how to trust. Too often princes were surrounded by flatterers whose advice was designed to serve not his interest but their own. He should instead take care to surround himself with only wise, experienced advisers. The third and final thing that a prince needed was a broad-based government. Given that Renaissance states were generally racked by tensions between the grassi, literally the fat cats, and the popolo, the people, it was important to know how to handle their rivalry. As Machiavelli knew, princes were generally inclined to rely most heavily on the grassi, since their interests usually aligned with his own. But the grassi were avid only for their own gain. If the prince relied too much on them, some would eventually become disgruntled and rise against him, thinking of taking the whole cake for themselves. Far better for the prince to use the popolo as a counterweight. Not only were they more numerous, but they also had an interest in keeping the wealthy in check. Provided the prince didn't rely on them too much, and provided they were restrained by a muscular state religion and stern laws, there was every reason, Machiavelli believed, to give them an equal, if not more prominent role in government. There were plenty of examples of leaders who reflected examples of this, elements of this. Machiavelli praises Hannibal for his harshness, Julius II, the warrior pope, for his daring, hard to believe but true, and Cesare Borgia for ruthlessly executing his rebellious captains. But how radical was this really? Well, less than's usually thought. Granted, in conception and approach, the Prince was certainly novel. Machiavelli's abandonment of moral idealism for realism did mark a break with the past, but the more closely we look at Machiavelli's arguments, the less radical he seems. Machiavelli was not trying to show how a prince could do whatever he wanted, nor did he believe that a prince should always be dishonest, cruel, and parsimonious. Despite what he sometimes claimed, he was neither the spokesman for tyrants nor the prophet of amorality. He repeatedly stressed that prudence, justice, etc. did have some value, and that if a prince could exercise them, then all well and good. He even praised Cosimo de' Medici for embodying these ideals. He was simply trying to illustrate that if a prince wanted to survive, his actions shouldn't be constrained. In any case, their inverse was not nearly as bad as sometimes made out. Machiavelli's goals were modest too. Throughout his career, he was preoccupied not with furthering the ambitions of an individual, but with maintaining the state in liberty and under its present government against the threats from within and without. Hardly a really radical aim. Finally, many of his ideas were already familiar. His dictum that it's better to be feared than loved was probably riffing off Seneca's critique of the adage that they should let them hate as long as they fear. So too, his preference for cruelty over compassion can be traced back to opinions expressed by France's generals. And back in 1499, the state of France had executed a general, Paolo Vitelli, without any evidence at all, just pour encourager les autres. So, what can leaders learn from Machiavelli today? Again, not what we usually think. Though his writings have a striking immediacy, we need to distinguish between relevance and resonance. Each of Machiavelli's works was written with a specific audience in mind to address a specific purpose in a specific context. The Prince, dedicated to Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici, was intended to show how a prince who had won his state with the arms of others and the help of fortune could stay in power. The Discorsi was addressed to a group of rebellious youths in an attempt to show them how not to misuse ancient literature, and so on and so forth. None of these works was intended to serve posterity over the present, and none of those circumstances were repeated today. Though they might have some resonances, it's misguided to see them as having direct application to our own situation, much less apply them to fields like business or management. So too, we need to remember that Machiavelli didn't set out to provide a blueprint for leadership. His comments on mercenaries and classes apart, he was too pragmatic, too attuned to the wilds of fortune to propose a set of unyielding rules valid in all circumstances at all times. Rather, he just wanted to show the sort of things that a leader should be ready to do if the circumstances required. He didn't offer an educational program to make leaders and left open the question of whether good leaders are born or made. So even if there are contemporary resonances, we should be wary of looking for a model in Machiavelli's writings. But what Machiavelli does provide us with is a framework for analysing leadership, for interrogating political leaders, their decisions and approach. Did, for example, Carlos Puigdemont fail to achieve Catalonian independence because of a simple lack of daring? Was the same true of Juan Guaido in Venezuela? Was Liz Truss's choice of advisers her undoing? More controversially, was Boris Johnson's real fault not being dishonest enough? Shh. How misguided is Putin's reliance on mercenaries? And how much does he benefit from his connections with the Orthodox Church? Now, Machiavelli offers no answers to these. But if we follow his method and let ourselves be led by a clear-eyed assessment, free from assumptions about right and wrong, we may find ourselves arriving at an understanding of what is both appropriate and necessary. So, if I can leave you with a final thought, let it be this. Machiavelli was certainly less Machiavellian than he's usually made out. His relevance for leaders of today is less than his resonance, and the direct lessons he can teach us are few. Yet, if his writings, read without the burden of preconceptions, can be used to interrogate rather than to prescribe, they can still help us to grapple with the problem of leadership in this most uncertain and most Machiavellian of worlds. Thank you.
But when did his book, Il Principe, become this blueprint for ruthless leadership and sly statecraft?
Pretty quickly is the answer. Not in the sense of it being taken as a blueprint, but regarded as something wicked. Within a few decades of his death, contemporary, not near contemporaries, the next generation, people like Cardinal Pole were describing the Prince as having been written by Satan's hand. And that was simply because of Machiavelli's break with the traditional view that virtue and morality should be the guide of a prince's actions. It wasn't necessarily because it was a book about tyranny or whatever, it was just because it was unusual in approach. And later on, it becomes his attitudes towards the use and abuse of religion become used, and morality, become used paradoxically by both sides in the great wars of religion. Protestants and Catholics alternately start accusing one another of being Machiavellian and also occasionally claiming Machiavelli for themselves. So it's a very confused picture, but these conflicting interpretations, including that of Machiavelli as the wicked monster, appear pretty quickly.
You said his concept virtu is something different from our concept of virtue. He also has the idea of fortuna as something important. How should we interpret this? Is that just what we mean with fortune?
No, well, as I said at the beginning, fortune, the allegorical goddess of chance, is traditionally viewed, up until Machiavelli's day, as a blind woman who is turning a wheel on which sit several figures. When the figure is at the top, they are traditionally shown as like the king, I am the king. Then as the wheel turns, I was king, I am just at the bottom, and I will be king again, and it turns around. The idea being that we can't control this cycle of fate that we inevitably are exposed to. However, by the time Machiavelli is reaching maturity, a change is occurring in Italian and particularly Florentine thinking, and there's been some very, very, very good recent work done on this by Nicholas Baker. I thoroughly recommend his book. And it moves towards viewing fortune as this capricious woman. As I described, someone who has absolutely no regard for people's goodness or badness, but who will do just whatever she likes and seems to derive some pleasure from making lives unpleasant. Now, Machiavelli may have found this a particularly apposite image because he was a pretty rotten husband and was always messing around and rightly getting told off.
Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you very much.
That's great. I said earlier we framed our view on antiquity by looking at Athens and mainland Greece. And now we will find another big, important power in antiquity. Ollie, welcome up on the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to insert a little bit of Persian imperialism into our narrative here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the contribution that I think that the ideas of Persian kingship and the ideas of empire in Iran and the wider Persianate world have contributed into our larger understanding of statecraft. And then I will focus more squarely on the figure of Cyrus the Great as this sort of epitome of the ideal ruler. Someone who features a great deal in Western narratives, in fact, much more in Western narratives and mythology than he does actually in Iran for large periods of that history. For the larger periods of the history from late antiquity onwards, the figure of Cyrus the Great basically recedes back into myth in a way that it's not explicitly sort of addressed in terms of a heroic figure. He comes back into the narrative very, very emphatically at the end of the 19th century, as we will see also in the 20th century in Iran. And in actual fact, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, quite ironically, of course, Cyrus the Great is an extremely popular figure, very counterintuitively, as you will see in a minute. But he still remains very popular in certain countries in the West. And here, with supreme irony, of course, the two countries that sort of praise Cyrus the Great to high heaven are Israel and the United States. So if we can ever get to the Cyrus Accords, we should get those three countries back to the table together again, all agreeing on one thing. Now, if you ever have the opportunity to go to Persepolis, which I know is increasingly rare these days, but if you do get the opportunity to go to Persepolis, you will notice something distinct about the way in which power is represented. If you were to go to earlier empires, the Assyrians and the Babylonians and others, most of the friezes that they have when they're showing are friezes of conquest. Murder, rape, pillage, beheadings, so on and so forth. In Persepolis and other Achaemenid, the ancient Persian sites of the first of the Persian empires, you see something quite different. You see ceremonial. You see the king in his sort of his grandeur. This is Darius sitting with Xerxes, the crown prince, behind him, receiving visitors. And if you look along most of the friezes, what you see are parades of supplicants and people bearing gifts. And one of the striking things about the Achaemenid form of government, and this is one of the things I really want to emphasize in terms of Persian approaches, is that they make a clear distinction, and it's one of the first times, I think, in that sort of world historical experience, that authority becomes the primary organ of how you administer large tracts, imperial lands, rather than simple coercive power. That doesn't mean that power itself is not exercised, of course it is. But the fact is, the ancient Persian Empire in particular was not a militarized state in the way that you would find with later imperial structures, let's say even in the Persian heartlands, but certainly like, say, the Roman Empire. This was something, and you have to remember the size of the Persian Empire at this period. We're talking from the 5th to the 3rd century BC. You're talking about an empire that stretched from the Oxus, the Indus, through to Greece, and up towards what we would have modern Libya. For that to be governed as a single polity required a certain sense of authority and narrative. And the narrative and mythological basis in that sense of that hegemony, if you will, required a certain understanding of a moral universe. So one of the things that I think the Persians contribute to our understanding, in a sense, of statecraft and understanding of leadership is this notion of a moral universe, in this case structured around a Zoroastrian framework, a Zoroastrian understanding. And they introduce a number of new sort of ideas into that, into our understanding. First of all is this notion that in the Zoroastrian worldview, that man is an agent of good. Okay, man is a good creation, and women, a good creation that basically is an active agent in the pursuit of good, in the assistance of the wise Lord Ahura Mazda. That means that mankind is not simply a plaything of the gods, but mankind is there, serves a purpose. Therefore, man has a role to play. Okay, so one of those things is that the king, as the sort of the link between the earthly world and the spiritual world, has a function there to basically pursue the good life, the good religion, and that sort of good moral code. So what you find there with the Persian Empire and these sort of ideas of kingship is a very key sort of sense of moral purpose. That doesn't mean, by the way, that they're always good. It just means that they always think they're right. Okay, so I mean, that's the important thing. When the Persian king says that God protect us, or wise Lord protect us from the lie, you know, modern Iranians say this shows how honest we all were and whatever, and Herodotus says, you know, all Persians were taught how to, you know, ride, shoot the bow and tell the truth. Of course, in a much more sinister way, it's actually more to do with ideology here. You know, what we're saying is the lie, you're going to get punished. I know what the truth is, and I'm going to tell you. So in some ways, there's that very, very clear moral universe of which, you know, man plays a very, very functional role, and the king is absolutely central to that spiritual connection. Cyrus, of course, plays an absolute pivotal role, certainly in the Persian Empire, as the father of the Iranian nation, or the Persian nation, the Persians and the Medes. He's critical in terms of a figure that is seen to have done things differently. And of course, in a Western understanding, we know the figure of Cyrus through both our biblical texts and our classical texts. By and large, most of our understanding of the historical figure of Cyrus is seen through those classical texts and, of course, the Bible. He is one of two messiahs in the Old Testament. Don't forget that, of course. He's one of the two of the Lord's anointed. So he's very popular, obviously, in the Hebrew Bible, hence his popularity in Israel today. But also in the classical world, he was seen by the Greeks very much as the person who knew how to govern. He was the person, if you look, we were speaking earlier about the patchwork, what was it, the 1,000 city-states of the Greek world. Here you had someone who was able to master and bring together a whole range of different peoples under a single authority. And how did he do that, of course? He did that by understanding how to win the peace, something that we've forgotten in the Western world, I have to say. But how to win the peace. It's not a question of simply subjugating the Babylonians. You have to put out a nice Cyrus cylinder that tells you how much I love your God, and you can put him back, and I'm here to protect you, and actually, I'm here to free you. Okay, there's nothing better in terms of mythology than the myth of emancipation. And Cyrus is presented really as the great emancipator, but not just for the Persians. He's seen, obviously, as the person who liberated the Persians. Herodotus says this. But the fact is, wherever he goes, he presents himself as the great emancipator. And that, of course, is a good way of basically hoodwinking people you've just conquered. Okay, to say, I haven't come to conquer you, I've come to free you. Great stuff. Again, in terms of establishing your authority, that is something that that I think the Persians did, certainly in this phase, or in this period with Cyrus, did somewhat differently to what came beforehand. I don't want, and just in case any of you, he did not set up the first Charter of Human Rights, by the way, just in case anyone wonders about that. This is where the mythology gets carried away with itself, and I think ruins it, I have to say, because then we're all forced to say what a load of nonsense this is. Of course he wasn't setting up the first Charter of Human Rights. But what he did do was different. And if it wasn't different, figures such as Xenophon, who wrote the Chiropedia, the Education of Cyrus, which became very popular again in the Western world, figures such as Xenophon, would not have been so adulatory about him. There was clearly something quite different about the way in which he operated. So I think it's really about that notion that he operated in a very political sense, not just a military sense, and that he also was able really to construct authority. So here on the right, you see in Persepolis a picture, it's an engraving of the king, again, dealing with the beast that you'll be familiar, of course, in the sort of book of Revelation and others, this sort of Zoroastrian sort of mythical beast that is the sort of identification with evil. The role of the king there is to defeat evil. It's to crush evil. And that's a sort of replication of that. Now, later, in the later Persian imperial setups and the period of both the Parthians and the Sasanians from about 220 AD to 640, you get a further development of many of these ideas that emerge. This frieze is from a place near Persepolis, which I don't know if you can see it very clearly, to be honest, but basically it is the image of the king receiving effectively what is the ring of power from the deity, and the ring of power to convey that bond and that commitment and that oath. It's about basically committing to governing in the right and the just way. So that element of morality is absolutely vital to the way that in which they sort of structure their universe. Justice and the concept of justice and the king as the provider of justice is absolutely central. And a critical element here is also this notion of divine grace. And I want to really specify that because it's not a concept of divine right, and it's not about deifying the monarch. You don't get ideas of deification in the Persian world, not in the same way as you get in the Hellenic and Roman world. What you do get is this notion that the good king, by doing good deeds, enhances his divine grace. And by doing wicked deeds, he loses the divine grace. So you can see in that sort of motif, in a way, it's an interesting dynamic. You're not there forever by divine right just simply because of your birth. You're there because of the deeds that you do. And I think that's quite an important distinction. So if you look actually in Persian mythology and others, and certainly later texts like the Book of Kings that comes afterwards in the Muslim period, as a redaction really of this earlier sort of studies, there are kings who fall. There are kings that are overthrown. There is regicide, for instance. But this is because these kings, through hubris, through performing wicked deeds, basically lose that divine grace. So I won't go through a couple of ideas that clearly come through into the medieval Islamic world. Certainly ideas of religion and the role of religion and kingship are very tied within the Persian world. This is something, obviously, that in the Muslim Caliphate they borrowed. But I will quickly sort of run through, if I may, some of the more modern conceptions, because people often forget, I was talking to some people in the interval, just how central, in many ways, these Persian ideas, and certainly the education of Cyrus, was to Western literature, actually, and to Western ideas of good government. Not least, actually, in the founding fathers in the United States. I mean, Jefferson had, I'm told, certainly had 2 copies of the Chiropedia. Now, the interesting thing with the Chiropedia is that it is largely seen as mythic, and it is. I mean, it's not really a realistic assessment of Cyrus's life. But increasingly, historians are of the view that actually what Xenophon was doing was really portraying and putting in writing the Persian version of Cyrus's life. And that's quite interesting. It wasn't simply a fictitious account. It wasn't a mirror for princes purely on its own merits. It was something that Xenophon himself had heard. And as we know, Xenophon spent a long time in the service of Cyrus the Younger, who he very much also admired a great deal. And it's very possible, certainly we couldn't know for a fact, but it's very possible certainly that the tale in Xenophon is that perception of Cyrus the Great that the Persians themselves felt was realistic. But here on the left, you see a book that the Stuarts were very keen on the Chiropedia, not that it did Charles I much good, but there is Charles I's personal copy of the Chiropedia. James I also, or James VI, I should say, was also very keen on learning the lessons of the Chiropedia and what Cyrus represented. Here are tapestries coming from the Spanish royal palaces in Parma, again denoting the life of Cyrus. Again, very central to our notion of what kingship and the ideas of ideal kingship should be. Here, in the politics of Cyrus in the Islamic Republic, just to show you how absurd things can get, and of course, you know, as we say, myths are very powerful drivers of action, but they don't always make sense. In fact, they very rarely make sense, but that's not the point. The point is it appeals to something deeper. Ahmadinejad here on the right, our great firebrand president, awarding Cyrus the Great a medal for great deeds for Islam, or whatever that was. Again, very sort of absurd, but he was a very keen supporter of Cyrus the Great, and Cyrus the Great in the Islamic Republic has become known as the first Muslim. Don't ask. But that's a. Here on the left, on the other hand, is something more interesting, as you'll see at the end, is the fascination of Cyrus the Great among modern Iranians. Modern Iranians view Cyrus the Great as an emblematic and an iconic figure for basically everything that is not the Islamic Republic. And if you look at the figure here, he's actually praying to the tomb of Cyrus the Great. If any of you, by the way, do get to go to Iran, do make the effort to go and see the tomb of Cyrus the Great. It is really 2 minutes. It is really something. So I'm going to end on a finale now for your guy. So the tomb is really something to see. It is 4 hours from Shiraz. It's a bit of a hike, but it has, I think, one of the best epigraphs of any tomb, which basically says, you know, "O man, I am Cyrus, who gave an empire to the Persians. Begrudge me not this simple monument," which I think is marvelous. That's what Alexander found, anyway. Don't mention that word in front of me, Alexander. Anyway. So, the politics of Cyrus in the West, of course, very, very popular. Again, in Israel, commemoration, I think Jerusalem is the one city outside Iran that has a Cyrus the Great street. Very popular in Israel. But perhaps the most absurd, really, is Donald Trump as Cyrus the Great, which is represented by this coin issued by some of his supporters, a medallion, I should say, in which it quotes Isaiah, you know, the biblical text really on Cyrus the Great, and draws an analogy. You can't see this, unfortunately, as well. The hair is there. There is also, you know, a figure of Cyrus the Great, although we don't know what he looked like. Of course, we have no idea anything about it. I mean, you can basically put what you want on him. The interesting thing about this, and this is something that maybe Paul at some stage can answer for us, is how popular the term Cyrus is within Puritan societies. I don't know why. It's obviously something in the biblical, but both Obama and Trump were hailed as the Cyrus, the new Cyrus. So it was very much viewed as that. I'll stop there, Ulf, because I can see that my authority is waning. Thank you.
We could gladly have listened to more, but we couldn't. This idea of a moral universe, did that have an influence on the shaping of Greek democracy?
Did it have
It's a contemporary idea floating around in the region.
I mean, the interesting thing is, and others here in this room I think will know better than me, to be honest, is to what extent you get the influence of Persian ideas, religious ideas on the Greek world. And clearly there are. But it's difficult to know. I mean, you can see with certain writers, you know, that they are borrowing from various Persian ideas. There are some arguments, very controversial, but loved by people in Iran, that Plato in some ways was borrowing very much, and the whole idea of the philosopher king is really very much borrowed from an idea from a Persianate concept. But of course, we can never know that because we don't have texts. I mean, that's the problem. We don't have written literary sources from this period.
Ollie, thank you very much this far. Thank you. Lucy Ward on the fascinating story of Catherine the Great. Not from rags to riches, but from nothing to empress.
Yeah, very dramatic. Thank you very much for inviting me too. I'm just a humble journalist and writer in this esteemed group of people. So like a true journalist, I'm just going to tell you a story. It's just one example of statecraft, really. But one that's really very little known. So, less than a decade into her 34-year reign, Catherine II of Russia commissioned a commemorative medal from the engraver Timofey Ivanov of the St. Petersburg Mint. And on one side was a conventional image of herself in profile, looking quite glamorous. And on the other was something curious. I'm sorry, it's really hard to see. I'll describe it. It was a depiction of the Empress holding the hand of her son, Paul, and reaching out to a grateful mother and children with her right hand. And behind her on the ground, below the classical facade of a temple, lay the slaughtered body of the multi-headed monster, Hydra. So this scene is clearly allegorical, but what did it mean? To understand that, we have to look at the date on the medal. That's the 12th of October, in the year 1768. And that's the day on which Catherine had herself secretly inoculated against smallpox, the most devastating disease of the 18th century, by an English Quaker doctor named Thomas Dimsdale. He travelled all the way from Hertfordshire, all the way 1,700 miles or so, to St. Petersburg to carry out this task. The procedure, inoculation, was the forerunner of vaccination, so it came before Edward Jenner, and it involved deliberately infecting a healthy patient with a minute quantity of live virus through a scratch in the arm. It was safer than it sounds, but it still carried risk. So this is Thomas Dimsdale, the doctor, obviously Catherine. So this is the actual lancet that was used to inoculate Catherine, and it's still in the family of the doctor. It's been handed down. I won't leave you looking at that and thinking about pustules. And we'll leave it at that for slides because I'm obviously not the most competent with them. So Catherine decided that she and her son should undergo inoculation to protect their own lives in the midst of a devastating epidemic wave of smallpox in St. Petersburg. But she also had a second motivation. She wanted to overcome the widespread superstition over inoculation in Russia. People basically believed that if you gave the pus for the inoculation, you would die. And she wanted to introduce this procedure across her empire. And there was a benevolent element to this. Smallpox was a hideous disease that at the time struck almost everyone. Almost no one escaped it. Parents told not to count their children until they'd had smallpox. And it disfigured and often blinded those that it didn't kill. But she also had an economic motivation here. Every life saved, of course, increased the wealth of the state. She was very concerned about child mortality. It was exceptionally high, and there were thousands lost to smallpox alone annually. So to come back to this carefully curated image on the medal that you can remember, we can see that the slaughtered Hydra represents not only smallpox, but prejudice itself. Supported by the power of the Orthodox Church, officially at least, don't know how keen they really were on it in practice, but she roped them in, Catherine defied the monster. She defies the monster, and she now receives the thanks of grateful Russia and her population. But there's another resonance here too. By casting herself in metal, Catherine's seeking to promote and immortalise not only this single political act, but her leadership as a whole. And above the image on the coin are the words that she herself set an example, or we might translate it as she led by example. And that phrase takes just 3 words in Russian, but behind them was a complex message operating on a number of levels. On one level is that very personal declaration, that avowal that she herself has taken a risk. She's put her own life on the line on behalf of her people. She's empress, but her leadership is personal and it's specifically female. We haven't really talked much about women in this talk yet. This test has been conducted on her own woman's body with its weaknesses and frailties that she willingly listed for her physician and told him to publish. We can read in his account of it all about everything from her piles to her the bleeding that she went through, to her diet, to her drinking, you name it. There were, incidentally, other women who played significant roles in promoting smallpox inoculation in the 18th century. They included Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, Caroline of Ansbach, who was wife of future King George II, and the British aristocrat Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. But they all used their inoculated children as examples. So they're really they're influencing like Catherine. They're using their motherhood as a means of conveying their trust in this procedure. But only Catherine ran the risk personally herself, as well as having her son inoculated. So she's a woman whose body is known today as the target of lascivious gossip and ridicule. We all know the apocryphal stories. In fact, one of my panel mates threw this at me just now and mentioned the horse, which I wasn't going to mention, but he did it. From her own era to today, she's been this target. Yet, in fact, it was an act of physical suffering that she promoted in this remarkable act of statecraft. So having taken her risk and recovered from the very unpleasant side effects of inoculation, she claimed, by the way, to have got through it by having the works of her beloved correspondent Voltaire read aloud to her. She said that was her medicine. That's what she told him anyway. Her mission was to use her personal example to persuade her deeply sceptical subjects to follow suit. And for that, she had to publicize, she had to promote, she had to influence. And here we really start to see her brand of leadership emerge. She recognizes, and in fact she explains this to her doctor, that though she is an autocrat and she could compel her subjects to be inoculated, coercion won't work when it comes to telling people what to do with their bodies. It's a rather familiar debate today. In fact, it's quite interesting. I came across this in a footnote to the doctor's account of this episode, where he talks about her explaining this, and she revealed to him that she was actually bribing local peasants to be inoculated. So she's almost sending herself up. She knew that she couldn't compel. It's an interesting insight. So instead, she opts to associate this rather terrifying, invasive procedure with basically positive vibes. So she celebrates her son's and her own recovery with a huge national party. Bells ring across the nation, buildings are illuminated, fireworks go off, and cannons fire. She gets the church on side. She holds an Orthodox Mass at the Winter Palace to give thanks for the whole episode. And then she does something even more popular. She declares an annual national holiday to mark her inoculation. This continues for decades. This is still being celebrated towards the end of her reign. But the message is more than get yourself inoculated, which, by the way, she backs up with practical measures. She builds inoculation hospitals at various points around the empire, and people do go. It's difficult to quantify exactly how many, but it certainly had an effect. Catherine's campaign's also about promoting herself and her own leadership. Her grip on power is stronger now than 6 years previously, when, of course, she ousted her husband Peter in a coup, but she's still a usurper and a foreigner. And through this Orthodox service and the political speeches of gratitude, she has herself portrayed in various ways. So not only as Matushka, the little mother of the Russian nation, but also as a Christ-like good shepherd. She explicitly likens herself to Christ, giving his body for his people. So she's elevating her physical act into a spiritual one, her scratch almost into a stigmata. So inoculation under her leadership becomes a sacrament. Now, this is dramatic stuff. Even Boris Johnson, I can't believe how often we've mentioned this man. I'm sorry I've done it, I've added it again. But when he posed for his COVID vaccine publicity shot, even Boris didn't go quite that far, didn't associate himself with Christ. But Boris would surely appreciate Catherine's appropriation of classical mythology. She commissions an allegorical ballet, and I really wish I had seen this, entitled Prejudice Defeated. Can you imagine people skipping across in which she's represented as Minerva defeating the fire-breathing monster Chimera, freeing the Russian people from the grip of ignorance. And at the same time, she's building her image at home. As she's building her image at home, Catherine turns abroad to maximise the promotional benefit of this inoculation. She fires off a storm of letters to influential correspondents whom she knows will immediately publish them. And she represents herself as a Western-oriented, enlightened leader who trusts data and scientific facts, and, by the way, who barely noticed her inoculation symptoms. She writes off saying, "Oh, I was barely in bed a day. It was nothing, absolutely nothing, hardly had a headache." And in fact, she's had dizziness, she's had sickness. It was pretty dramatic. She teases Frederick the Great, who had advised her not to risk this procedure. And she boasts to Voltaire, who was an outspoken advocate of inoculation, really, really very early adopter, you might say. And she boasts to him that she'd done it all as a tribute to him. And he wrote back, "You have been inoculated as easily as a nun taking an enema." And so you can feel free to use that line next time you admire someone you admire has a COVID jab. And this is interesting contrast, by the way, with George III in England, who was an extremely enthusiastic proponent of inoculation for his own children, all of them. Even though 2 died following the inoculation, he continued to have faith in it, as did his wife. But he didn't publicise it. He didn't kind of introduce it nationally. There was no national introduction of policy at all. So we can see from this one act, this scratch of a lancet that took just a few seconds, Catherine fashioned a multifaceted image of herself as leader, as loving mother, self-sacrificing, spiritual healer, rational, philosopher, scientist. And that process of deliberate self-creation is what's so fascinating and I think so recognisable today. You can read any political profile and we can see the successes of Catherine carefully curating their own stories. And for women in particular, it's a case of moving fast before someone else does it for them. So it wasn't the first time Catherine had shaped her own story. From 1756, she'd been writing an account of her life, her memoirs, up to the coup that brought her to power. She never got beyond that key moment. She couldn't reconcile that into this narrative. But she continued editing and recrafting this narrative right up to her death in 1796. And the text concentrated on her childhood and her early and unhappy marriage to Peter, and its episodes were carefully selected and presented to portray her as intelligent, charming, energetic, ambitious, and destined to rule. And often it's interesting how often she used personal, physical anecdotes about herself to help define her character. She describes how as a child she was made to wear a corset and a black ribbon tied across her body to correct the curvature of her spine. She also had spit rubbed on her back, allegedly to correct it too. Or her love of riding horses astride, like a man, dressed in man's clothing, in order to gallop without restraint. And here we can begin to see a pattern that prefigures Catherine's public presentation of her inoculation. She not only made the personal, the intimate, even political, but deliberately took examples of female bodily weakness and vulnerability and demonstrated how she had personally subverted them. So Catherine acknowledged norms and expectations around power and leadership, their fundamental associations with masculinity, and played on the tension with her own identity as a rare female leader, not the first to rule Russia, but the last to date. And in her memoirs, she wrote that she had a mind infinitely more male than female. But for all of that, I was anything but mannish, she wrote, and in me others found, joined to the mind and character of a man, the charms of a very attractive woman. She didn't, in other words, simply ape masculine qualities. She celebrated and used her woman's body as part of her construction of her particular form of power. So frailty or the perception of it could be flipped to become strength. I wrote a book about this episode in Catherine's rule during the COVID pandemic. And the parallels were obvious and startling. 250 years previously, she'd recognised the power of personal example as a tool of influence in public health policy. And as I researched her experiences, world leaders were rolling up their sleeves to be pictured getting their COVID jabs, and debates were hotting up over vaccination compulsion, the course of action that she'd rejected in favour of encouragement, despite her autocratic powers. And those resonances were unexpectedly literal, but others are almost as familiar, the conscious image-making of political leaders through careful crafting of personal narratives, and for women in powerful public roles, the delicate balancing of authority according to a masculine script with nods to a performed femininity. In Churchill College in Cambridge, just down the road from my home, one of Margaret Thatcher's famous handbags, simultaneously a badge of womanliness and a symbolic weapon, is still one of the most popular exhibits in the archive. And apparently people turn up and ask to smell it, believe it or not. I think also of Hillary Clinton's pantsuit and that kind of combination of the feminine and the masculine. I'm nearly done. Of course, women can never, ever truly get this balance right. Catherine used inoculation to build her image as a female ruler, but by the last years of her reign, as Russia's empire expanded threateningly westward, political cartoonists were portraying her rival leaders, all men, looking up her skirts and making lewd remarks as she strode across the map between St. Petersburg and Constantinople. That was still a long way in the future, though. At the time, Catherine had the medal minted to mark her inoculation, and she cast herself literally as a benevolent protector of her nation, as both mother and Hydra-slaying warrior. And then just days after her recovery, in November 1768, she took another step that would define her even more clearly as a strong leader. She declared war on Turkey, igniting the conflict that would see Russia take Crimea and other territory that is today southern Ukraine. In a letter to her ambassador in London, she wrote gleefully that the talk was of only two things, inoculation and war. Her victory in her inoculation against smallpox had made her feel invincible. And she wouldn't go to battle herself. She sent her soldiers off to sacrifice their own bodies in combat. And then the next act of her self-creation was beginning. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another interesting person to deal with, that is Marshal President Gustav Mannerheim, and we're very happy that Henrik Meinander, who's one of the leading experts on Mannerheim, is here to tell us the story about this enigmatic figure.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I read closely the directives about what I'm going to speak about, and so I'm not going to describe the life of Mannheim from birth to death, but focusing on actually the formation of his geopolitical thinking. First, some just facts. He was born in 1867 and died in 1951. Served 30 years in the Russian Imperial Army, returned to Finland during the Russian Revolution, and then led the Finnish army in 2 world wars, that is to say, First World War and Second World War. And then, as mentioned, ended as President of the Republic between 44 and 46. I have in my earlier works also focused on how political leaders, lead their country or their armies, and have, in a way, developed a kind of three-dimensional, applied a three-dimensional model in which I claim that the way a person leads his nation, his state is based on 3 things. The first is his or her biological and social cultural background, his or her career up until the moment when she or he takes over, the preparation years, I could say. That is, of course, very important to take in account when we look at how a person is capable of taking responsibility and lead and rescue the country, which was the case with Mannerheim, both in World War I and World War II. But the other dimension is, of course, the context, especially when talking about a military or political leader in a small country as Finland. It's no use to claim that you can change the framework in which you work. You are thrown into the situation and have to cope in that very sort of harsh situation. Of course, also that is the case in peace time, but it's of course it's not necessary to emphasize the difference between peace and war too much. There's still a lot of course, challenges and problems also in peacetime. But in Mannerheim's case, actually, he had not a responsible position, between the two world wars. He was in a way lost pretty soon after he had led the white Finnish army against the revolutionaries in 1980. He lost his position and returned actually in power as a commander-in-chief only in 1939. But it is not, of course, not only the geopolitical context that you have to look at. That is to say, the things that you cannot change, but you have to cope with, and with that also then use the knowledge, the character you have got during the years of preparation. And the third dimension actually is coincidence, luck, destiny. And some of my colleagues have claimed that this is, pure laziness for a historian to claim that things just happen. You need to find a rational, logical reason for why things happen both on an individual level and occasional statecraft. Now, in Mannerheim's case, you can say that the first dimension, the biological, sociocultural, so to say, background, he had some obvious advantages. He had, a very strong physiology, attractive outlook and a strong body. And he had also, reasonably, a kind of, I wouldn't say that he was especially, his intellect was not especially sharp, but it was in a way, how should I describe it? I kind of, he had a capacity to find out the situation in which he and the nation or the army was in. That is not especially, it's not truly the same thing as sharp intellect, but those were, so to say, his background. Then, of course, born in a high aristocracy family in Finland, he had some obvious advantages, and his career early in the Russian army was very much thanks to the family contacts in St. Petersburg and not least also towards the imperial family. So those, so to say, advantages he clearly had. But then, of course, not everyone that had those advantages was able to use them properly. And in Mannerheim's case, I cannot emphasize enough his nature of being a streber, to the wish to show to his contemporaries that he was capable to reach something, because in his early life as a teenager he was not a success in the cadet schooling, but then during his following years in Russia he was actually performing very well. Then, of course, when he continued his career in Russia, he also showed very much also skills as a soldier in the Russian-Japanese War, and especially when he did a almost 2 years long espionage mission through Central Asia between 1906 and 1908. That was something that really strengthened and formed his character. I know it sounds old-fashioned to talk about character building, but in Mannerheim's case, I claim this was his, the moment when his character was formed in the way, not only in question how to show resilience, but also to understand the geopolitics. It's still a huge country, Russia, and first traveling to Manchuria and take part in the Russian-Japanese War, and then ride 14,000 kilometers through Central Asia, and then collecting, of course, military information about the Chinese preparation for next war. And then the career in First World War and returning actually to Finland in December 1970. So those were, so to say, the background that really you have to take in. This is the preparation of the leader. But then, of course, the tests arrived. He had reached to the rank of general lieutenant during the First World War, but when he returned to Finland and led the counter-revolutionary army, the White Army, against revolutionaries in Finland, he was able to use not only his military knowledge but also his geopolitical thinking, because it is a complicated story, the war in Finland 1980. I will not try to explain to it. But my point is actually it was not a separate war. It was a part of the Russian Revolution and First World War. And he understood that. The German forces were also involved, and that he opposed very much. So his, in a way, role in that was short. Directly after the Red troops had been defeated, he had to leave because the Germans demanded it. But the second, of course, big moment was during the following World War. I'm talking now about the contextual dimension of my description of the way how a leader leads the country. And that was the preparation for that was Mannerheim actually lived as a private man for 20 years. And astonishingly enough, he returned at the age of 72 to again become a commander-in-chief. You know, when the regulations, according to the regulations, you should retire when you are 60. But his authority was so strong, and his kind of geopolitical thinking, advices to the Finnish government had been so decisive that when the Soviet troops then attacked Finland in last of November 1939, he was again named commander-in-chief. And during Second World War, actually, his role as a geopolitician was probably more important than his role as a military leader, because he was 72 and he had begun his career as a cavalryist, and it was not about the cavalry in Second World War. So clearly he was then able to use all these experiences that he had got from actually from 1890s onwards, and also decided that Finland should join the Operation Barbarossa in 1941, for which, of course, he was heavily criticized after Second World War. But in his discussions after that war, he admitted that it was the risk that Finland had to take. Of course, that was not something that he admitted in his memoirs that were published in the early 1950s, but to a close colleague, the man that followed him as a president, Juho Kusto Paasikivi, has said that it was a risk we had to take, and of course it didn't go like we thought, but Finland survived. Finland was not either occupied in the latter part of Second World War. The third dimension, coincidences, luck, destiny. How much did that play a role in Mannerheim's life? I would say actually astonishingly. I'm not a superstitious person, but and he is not either emphasizing that in his memoirs that were of course pretty much written by ghostwriters, but of course he edited it. But there was a number of times that he could pretty well have been killed on the battlefield, and also during the Russian Revolution. He traveled from Ukraine, from Odessa to Helsinki in December 1970. So there was a number of times when the railway was, was stopped, and the revolutionaries tried to drag him out, but he survived. And on one of the railway station, he saw the blood of one of his colleagues that had just been shot, and there was some, of course, attempts to murder him during 1918 and during Second World War. And you have to remember, he was 72 when Second World War broke out, and he was not in good condition anymore. Of course, he took his every morning. He rode for 1 hour, and in that way tried to keep in good condition. But on the other hand, I don't know if you say it in English that way, but in Finnish we say that you don't spit in the glass. And he did not either. But he was a tall man, you know, and so that's why he actually then survived. So it's in Mannerheim's case, actually, it is possible, I claim, to use these three explanations for how you know, a leader is formed and how he then is able to cope with these harsh and extreme conditions that he and his country is thrown into. And I have just got my Mannerheim biography that is translated into English, now published in Great Britain, and that's why I'm especially glad to speak about that theme. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now we move to a special address from Oleksii Goncharenko. Now, brief introduction. He's a member of the Ukrainian Parliament and a member of the Ukrainian delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Now, for understandable reasons, very difficult to travel from Ukraine at the moment during the spring offensive, so we are joined remotely. Welcome to Engelsberg. Oleksii, the floor is yours for up to 15 minutes, and then I will pose some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I need to say several words. I'm not with you, not because there are some, I mean, I was ready to take all the difficulties of traveling from Ukraine. There are such difficulties now. Unfortunately, I have not received the permission from the Speaker of the Parliament to join you. And it's about, unfortunately, that some political games already restarted in Ukraine. And when you are in a ruling party, it's easier to receive such permission today than if you are not, like in my case. But I just want to speak about more important things, and exactly what I mentioned a little bit about unity, because like the main thing why Ukraine is so successful today, and we are successful, is a story about David and Goliath. I mean, this war of Russian Federation, of Russian Empire against our country. That's because of unity of Ukrainian people, and we try to keep this unity as much as possible. And that's what makes us strong. Definitely, usually when you hear somebody from some country, people prefer to say about their endeavors, about heroic deeds of their country, of their nation. I just want to start with our failures, because Ukraine failed many times. Unfortunately, in our history, we failed many times, and that was an awful price for us. We failed in 1848, 1854 during our liberation war, and after which the control of Ukraine was taken by Moscow Kingdom, and that was a very historical moment for our nation, and we failed. And we failed like together with Bogdan Khmelnytsky, our very famous hetman, but he failed and we failed with him. Next time we failed in a half century with Ivan Mazepa and Charles XII, Swedish king, when under Poltava, Ukraine tried to liberate and to join the free world and the European world, but we failed again against Russian Empire, Peter the First, and we failed. And for 200 years, we didn't have a possibility for new struggle for independence. And we failed together with Ivan Mazepa. Both, by the way, Bogdan Khmelnytsky and Ivan Mazepa now are on Ukrainian money, but we failed with both of them. Next time we failed 100 years ago, at the beginning of 20th century, when the Russian Empire collapsed and Ukraine started to its independence, and we tried to create Ukrainian People Republic, independent state. But then we were again attacked by new reincarnation of Russian Empire called Soviet Union or Bolshevik Russia. And unfortunately, we lost the war for independence with our leaders of that time, Petlura and others. And again, we lost. After the consequences of this were awful during the 20th century, like Timothy Snyder is writing, Ukraine became part of this bloodlands, the most dangerous place to live in 20th century, because two world wars, genocide called Holodomor, organized by Bolsheviks against Ukrainians, we paid a huge price for our failure. So now we are again fighting, but what lessons we made? And I want to remind you that 16 months ago, before the Russian full-scale invasion started, all international embassies, foreign embassies, they left Kiev, including Swedish and all other countries. And you can see now kind of part of the screenshots about how Kiev would fail in 3 days, how Russia would prevail in several days and would win. But none of this really happened. Today, if we will take a month of May, during the May, Ukraine was attacked by 154 missiles. It's just a big missiles of Russian Federation, and also more than 400 drones. But all foreign embassies are in Kiev, and nobody is running away. Why? What is the difference? What changed during these 16 months? I think the most important that Ukrainians showed to the world that we can win and that we will win this time. But why? Why we will win this time after so many failures in our history? I think because Ukrainians made a very important lesson, and this is lesson about unity and about the fact that our victory depends not on one person, not on one leader, not on hetman, not on some great warrior, not on President Zelensky or anybody else. We are, the future of Ukraine is in the hands of the whole nation. And unity of the whole nation, when the whole nation is ready to fight everybody on their place, that makes difference. Now you see just a number of pictures about like what had happened. You see a small girl which was coming every day to weave camouflage and masking nets for our army. You can see territorial defense, which I joined, being member of the parliament when Russian invasion started. I joined territorial defense, defending Kiev, and I saw everything by my own eyes. I took arms in my hands. I'm not very good with Kalashnikov, and when in 1 month Russians were taken back, retreated from Kiev, I came back to my selfie-stick. I'm better with selfie-stick than with Kalashnikov. But I saw everything by my own eyes, how we were defending Kiev. And just ordinary people were making Molotov cocktails to stop Russian tanks. When in Melitopol, one of Ukrainian cities, the mayor was kidnapped by Russians, thousands of people came to the streets against armed Russians, people without any weapon, saying, we will fight for our mayor, we will fight for our city and for our country. When just usual people were lying under the tanks, literally under the tanks, to stop them moving forward on Ukrainian roads. That's what had happened. And that's why we succeeded to stop Russian invasion, which almost nobody in the world believed in. And that's why after 16 months, we are still fighting. And like you see how the young lady is learning how to shoot from Kalashnikov. You see pictures here, and you understand that this is the real war of the whole nation. But for the whole nation to fight like this, what is the most important word? That's the word trust. And we are speaking about leadership on Engelsberg seminar. You are speaking, and I will be delighted to see all the essays which will be prepared by so bright people. I was reading the names, and I just want to say thank you to all of you for all you're doing during your life. But the main topic is leadership. And I think that leadership is based on one word: trust. Trust. And we need to trust in people. Often when we're speaking about trust, it's about how we trust government or leaders. But I think what is very important is quite opposite. How the government, how elites trust in their people. That is very important. 1 month before invasion, President Zelensky said to Ukrainian people, there will be no invasion, nothing will happen, prepare for summer holidays. And that was a very big mistake, to speak like this with people. And in 1 month, horrible events started. The whole world saw it. And then President Zelensky made the right thing, coming to people and saying, I trust you. I will do my best here on my place. But I know that all of you, everybody of you, can do the best on their place. Somebody in the army, somebody, some journalist, some other person, no difference. Volunteers and Ukrainians did it. That this trust in people, that was very important. Like when I'm saying that that was a mistake to speak to people that nothing will happen, in half a year, President Zelensky gave an interview to Washington Post saying that we didn't want to cause panic in the country. And many people in Ukraine said at this moment, that is offensive for us. It means that we are not adults enough, that we should not be said truth. The truth is crucial. We want to know the truth. And from this time, and during these months, I think that the word truth and trust are the main words in Ukraine, because people want to know truth. And when they know that they are said truth, and when they know that they are trusted, they are doing their best. You see how people are saving during this awful last ecological disaster, not natural, but man-made disaster by Russians. They destroyed Kakhovka Dam, which is the catastrophe of a planetary scale, and how people were coming from the whole Ukraine to Kherson with their boats, just ordinary fishermen from different regions of Ukraine, just to save people from the flood. You see how many Ukrainians bought a satellite for their army, just ordinary Ukrainians. And a part of this ocean of Ukrainian volunteering is a network of Goncharenko centers, which I am proud to be founder of and to run already for several years. You see now the map of Ukraine, and you see the names of our centers throughout the whole country, from east to west, from north to south. Today, one of our centers in Oleksii is still occupied, and now it's not just occupied, it's drowned under the flood. It's awful what's happening there. But we're still doing our best. Our network is an educational cultural, the biggest in Ukraine educational cultural network. In our centers, children and adults learn free of charge English language, our German, French, other languages. By the way, we'll be happy maybe one day Swedish language. And we continue to do this. We became a shelter for education for thousands of Ukrainian people. Our youngest student is 4 years old. Our oldest is 84 years old. And we are proud of this. But during these 16 months, our network also became a volunteer network, trying to help people, and definitely humanitarian aid. But also we're helping our army. We made more than 50,000 of square meters of masking nets. We bought 25 anti-drone rifles for our army. We bought 70 vehicles. And even, just imagine, educational cultural network bought a self-propelled howitzer, 122 millimeters, which is like a tank, easily saying, to our army. And that's what we are doing, but that's what all Ukrainians today are doing, because they know that they're fighting for their country. One very important thing is decentralization. That was one of the bases of Ukrainian resilience. I was, during my previous term in the parliament, I was responsible for decentralization. And I just want to tell you that it is one of the most powerful reforms we did. By the way, Swedish experience we also used. And I want to encourage all of you to develop decentralization in your countries as much as possible, because this is about trust to people. Because people finally, after decades of Soviet Union, after decades of suppression, after decades of when they were told what to do, they finally started to decide how their communities, how their cities and villages should live. And that made so strong ground and a foundation for people to fight for their homes, because they clearly started to understand that they are the only one who really responsible for their homes. And they did it. And that's something which is very powerful, very important. let's go ahead. I want to ask next slide. We are saying in Ukraine that the most democratic place is our residential building charts. I don't know, do you have such in your countries, but this is the most democratic place where everything is discussed, and you can see this spirit of Ukrainians. And this spirit coming back, I started from history. This spirit is from centuries ago, because in 17th century, Ukrainians were electing their hetmans, electing general at that time, not in the way with the ballots, but with their hats and throw into the air for one of the candidates. But that was democracy, and that makes us strong. And that today shows how alive and vivid is Ukrainian civil society life. And the example of this is this chart, which we tried to show you by this slide. So let's go ahead, please. I just want to continue and to say to you that we will do our best. We will win this war. Our lessons to the whole world are next. Believe in people. Their leadership starts from trust. And that is so important. The leadership starts from truth. That is the difference. The war of Russian Empire against Ukraine is a war of vertical against horizontal. That's Russian vertical with the emperor on top. And sorry to say this, but slaves on the bottom is against Ukrainian horizontal, where all Ukrainians are helping one another, where all Ukrainians are fighting this war as one organism, because they believe to one another and they know that nobody will do their job for them. So please, next slide. And I just want to say what's going on now in Ukraine. It's not a one-man war. We tried in Ukrainian history several times to have one-man war, and we lost them. And I think it was predictable. Now we have an every-man war, and that's why we will definitely win this war. Thank you very much, and I will be absolutely delighted to answer your questions.
Thank you. First question is really about the spring offensive. What are your hopes and realistic expectations of that offensive?
First of all, it looks like spring offensive is a really summer offensive. Yeah, but I want to be very cautious. First of all, I'm not a military person, and probably it's better somebody with more military experience. My 1 month in territorial defense doesn't give me any real opportunity to make conclusions. Definitely, there should be no too high expectations, because Russia during this 1 year they were preparing. They digged into the ground. They made huge fortifications, which you can see from the space, from satellites. They are ready for our attack. They try to be ready. Definitely, we believe in our army, and we will do our best, and our army will do their best. But it will be very difficult. Russians still have advantage in the skies to attack, and we don't have really advantage in numbers. So we don't have more troops than Russians. So just imagine we are attacking with this more or less the same amount of people against the army which is entrenched, which is in defense, which was preparing this position for 1 year with the superiority in the skies. Yeah, we have some advantages. Our weaponry, thanks to our allies, and thanks to all of you who are helping Ukraine today. I saw many names in the list of participants who I know are doing a great job for our country. I just want to say thank you to all of you. But that is not just about Ukraine. It's about the whole free world. That's why you are doing this, I believe in. But even with this modern Western weaponry, I can't tell you for sure that this offensive will solve the war once and forever. I think that it will take weeks and weeks, and it is absolutely possible that we will have, I'm sure that we will have gains, but it can be possible that Russia will not collapse, and Russian army in Ukraine will not collapse. So it's too early for the moment to give final conclusions. But again, we should be prepared that the results will be, but maybe not so crucial as we hope. The only way for us, if we want this offensive to be more resultive, is just to give to Ukraine more weaponry. I just want to tell you that it is very frustrating. I saw everything by my own eyes. If in March 2022, Ukraine would have weaponry that we received after in May, June, July of last year, then we would finish everything in April, when Russians were disorganized, retreating from Kiev, but we didn't have what to purchase them. You know, at the beginning, Ukraine was receiving just Stinger javelins. It was starved for guerrilla fighting because, as I told you, the West did not believe that Ukraine could survive. Then it was a moment when Russia still had not mobilized. It was the end of summer when Ukraine made our first counteroffensive, and it was extremely successful. But we didn't have what to purchase Russians again. We didn't have modern armor, tanks, armored vehicles, and that limited us in our possibilities. And that was very frustrating. And again, today we are attacking, but we still don't have F-16s. Today there is a Ramstein meeting again, and we know that finally Ukrainian pilots are started to be trained, but it's just now, and it will take months till they will be prepared. So if you want, I'm finishing, sorry for one answer.
No, not at all.
If we want this offensive to be really effective, I address to all of you, give to Ukraine ATACMS, F-16, more tanks. When we're speaking about 80 new tanks that Ukraine received, 80, but Russia at the beginning of this invasion had more than 12,000. We understand that the numbers also matter. So the more weaponry Ukraine will receive, quicker we will win the war, and better it will be for the whole planet.
Are you worried about European unity? We saw each other in Estonia last autumn. There has been a lot of help offered by European countries. And a lot of support, but more support in some countries than in other countries. Do you think that support can sustain?
Yeah, I think that I hope so. I hope so, because I think that many people in Europe and in other countries, and not in Japan and other countries, when we are saying with the West, I don't like this word. I like the word free world. I believe in free world. I believe that, I don't know, in several decades, either the whole world will be free or the whole world will be divided between a number of dictators. I don't believe that we can coexist with dictatorships. Sooner or later, as we see by this war of Russia against Ukraine, the conflict will start, because you can't live together to just across the border, dictatorship and free country. That doesn't work. So I believe that people in free world, they realize that in Ukraine, there is at stake not just our independence of our country, much, much more. International law, the future of the planet, how we will develop, where the law will work in the world or not, whether the democracy is really democracy stronger than dictators or not, and many, many other crucial questions for the future of humanity, of humankind. So that's why I believe there will not be exhaustion of the West. There is enough, of the free world. But you need to understand, I am saying it to our friends from the United States, first of all, because this is the biggest country from all points of view in the support of Ukraine, that if you think that you can provide, because today we see this incremental support style. Okay, we will, like, at the beginning we ask for Patriots. No, we will not give you Patriots. We will not give you tanks. We will not give you howitzers and HIMARSs. Then, okay, we will give you HIMARSs. Okay, we will give you howitzers. Okay, now we're speaking about that we will allow to give you fighter jets. Maybe we will give you ATACMS. That's what we're hoping for. But all the time, step by step, chasing after Putin, not making a step ahead of him. And what I'm telling to American friends and colleagues, which I'm very thankful to the United States of America and people of the USA. But I'm saying to them, please, you should understand that if you will move just by this incremental way, there is the most important resource, and this is not Abrams tanks and not HIMARSs. This is not fighter jets. This is Ukrainian people who are ready to die for these values. And unfortunately, during these 16 months, many of them already died. The best people of our country who took weapons in their hands, IT specialists, belly dancers, managers, marketologists, I don't know, professors who came to fight for the country. But you can't have, this resource is not unlimited. This is a limited resource. And sooner or later, we will run out of these people. And that can lead us to a real problem. And that's why I'm addressing the free world, saying that we need now all of this weaponry. Still we have who will be in these tanks, who will be in these fighters, who will do their job. That is so important, which I want to ask you to think about.
Oleksii, on that sobering and rousing, inspiring note, thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.